Okay, good morning, colleagues. Welcome to our witnesses. Bienvenue aux témoins.
I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Thank you for being here today. To share your perspectives on this complex issue. And here with us today, we have three witnesses: David McLaughlin, Craig Scott, and Graham Fox. I will sum up their bios, starting with Mr. McLaughlin.
Policy sector and has held a variety of senior positions in both the federal government and the New Brunswick provincial government. Mr. McLaughlin served as the Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Premier Bernard Lord, and Minister of Finance Jim Flaherty. He has also served in the New Brunswick government as Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Policy and Planning, and the New Brunswick Commission on Legislative Democracy. In the latter capacity, he managed the Commission's study on democratic reform, which produced a report with over 80 recommendations for electoral, democratic, and legislative reform. He was also the President and CEO of the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy from 2007 to 2012, and is a regular contributor to a variety of publications, including the Globe and Mail, Policy Magazine, and the Huffington Post. Professeur Greg Scott est professeur de droit à la faculté.
Craig Scott is a professor of law at York University's Osgoode Hall Law School and was the Member of Parliament for Toronto Danforth from 2012 to 2015. He attended Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and received a Master of Laws degree from the London School of Economics. His academic work has focused on international law with an emphasis on human rights. Professor Scott is series editor of Hart Monographs in Transnational and International Law and is founding editor of Transnational Legal Theory. He was a member of the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto from 1989 to 2001 and joined Osgoode Hall Law School in 2000. From 2001 to 2004, he served as the school's Associate Dean, Research and Graduate Studies. During his tenure as a Member of Parliament, he served as the New Democratic Party's opposition critic for democratic and parliamentary reform. Welcome, Mr. Scott. It's good to see you again here today.
CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy and has an extensive background in public policy. Mr. Fox has served as Chief of Staff to the Right Honourable Joe Clark and has been an advisor to members of Parliament. He has also held a number of positions in public policy research organizations, including Vice President of the Public Policy Forum and Executive Director of the KTA Center for Collaborative Government. Prior to joining the Institute for Research on Public Policy, Mr. Fox was a strategic policy advisor at the law firm Fraser Milner Casgrain, where he provided strategic analysis and advice in a variety of public policy fields. Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, I'll just mention the way we've been operating is after each witness presents for 10 minutes, we have 2 rounds of questions. In each round, each member gets to ask to engage with the witnesses. So what I mean by that is questions and answers must fall within a 5-minute time limit, and so then we do a second round in the same format. Je tiens à vous souligner que
I'd like to remind you that if the 5 minutes are over and you haven't had the chance to answer the questions, or you haven't had the chance to say everything, don't worry. Next time you speak, you will be able to finish up what you wanted to say and come back to former questions. So let's start With Mr. McLaughlin, 10 minutes, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your invitation to appear before you today. Let me begin by wishing you, first of all, every success in your work on this important matter that will affect all Canadians. I'm here as an individual with some expertise and knowledge of electoral reform deliberations as a Deputy Minister to the New Brunswick Commission on Legislative Democracy from 2003 to 2005. It is in this capacity that I'd like to share some observations and conclusions that I hope will assist you in your own deliberations and recommendations. The New Brunswick process and report was the most extensive democratic reform exercise ever conducted in that province. Electoral reform was a central, but by no means the only focus of the Commission's work. Specifically, the Commission was instructed to examine and make recommendations on how to strengthen and modernize New Brunswick's democratic institutions and practices in three main areas: electoral reform, legislative reform, and democratic reform. Electoral reform, from changing our voting system, drawing electoral boundaries, setting fixed election dates, and boosting voter turnout. Legislative reform, enhancing the role of MLAs and the Legislative Assembly, opening up the appointments process for agencies, boards, and commissions. And democratic reform, involving the public more in decision-making and proposing a referendum act. The Commission's goal was to present recommendations that would bring about fairer, more equitable, and effective representation in the Legislative Assembly, greater public involvement in decisions affecting people in their communities, more open, responsive, and accountable democratic institutions and practices, and higher civic engagement and participation of New Brunswickers. Our final report, copy here, over 200 pages long with some 100 specific recommendations, provided research, analysis, policy recommendations, and even specific legal text in a process of just over 1 year of actual meetings. The driving mission animating the Commission, which I commend to you in turn, was this: fostering a more citizen-led democracy. This focus on citizens led the Commission to develop three themes from which our recommendations flowed. Common to each was how democracy can be made to work better for, quote-unquote, you, the citizen. Those three themes: making your vote count, making the system work, and making your voice heard. When we were in doubt about our approach or faced trade-offs and choices, as you undoubtedly will, this citizen focus kept us grounded and, well, focused. So I want to highlight three areas of our work germane to the committee's mandate: democratic values and principles, electoral reform, and citizen engagement. The Commission began, as you did too, with a focus on democratic values. When it came to deciding the best electoral system for New Brunswick, we had to make trade-offs based on which of those values mattered most. You will too. The key principles we used to decide upon for a new electoral system were these. There was four. Local representation, the principle of all geographic areas of the province having a particular representative in the legislature to represent their interests. Fair representation, ensuring all New Brunswickers' voices were fairly represented in the legislature. Equality of the vote, ensuring each voter's ballot has equal influence in determining the election's winner. And finally, effective government, the ability of the system to result in the easy selection of a stable government that is able to govern the province. We use those principles to consider the strengths and weaknesses of various electoral systems and specific design features. These principles are quite similar to your list of values, with perhaps one notable difference: effective government. Your focus is on effectiveness within the electoral system. We also considered that too. But the Commission felt strongly that the outcomes of that electoral system had to include the notion of producing governments that could actually govern. Instability of legislatures and governments was very much on our minds. We recommended a mixed-member proportional system as optimal for the province based on a consideration of all the alternatives in relation to the roster of democratic principles. Animating New Brunswick's discussion most, though, was what was then a peculiar outcome of provincial politics: big majority governments and small, weak oppositions. Between 1987 and 1999, you may recall, the opposition never won more than 20% of the seats in the legislature, despite the combined opposition parties winning between 40% and 53% of the vote during the same period. MMP would fix that. MMP also approved appealing when considering the regional nature of urban and rural communities in the province. It also proved viable, and this was important to New Brunswick as Canada's only officially bilingual province, to ensuring equality of representation among the English and French linguistic communities. MMP's ability to create regions mapped to linguistic boundaries with party seats for topping up votes in a two-vote system was deemed attractive. We recommended a 56-seat House with 2/3 single-member seats elected via the current first-past-the-post system and 1/3 PR seats, choosing 5 MLAs from closed party lists in one of 4 multi-member regions on the basis of the party vote received within the region. The 2/3, 1/3 split enabled us to both ensure necessary local representation while introducing a sufficient degree of proportionality to be meaningful in translating votes into seats. A minimum 5% threshold in the separate party vote on the province-wide basis was required to be eligible to win any list PR seats. This was necessary to avoid a proliferation of single-issue parties with undue influence in the legislature. To ensure fairness and impartiality in the, change the page here. Candidates would be required to choose to run as either a single-member riding candidate or a regional PR list candidate, but not both, as a way to avoid perceptions of gaming the electoral system. Engaging New Brunswickers on our process, the eventual decision on a new electoral system was central to our consideration. Frankly, despite best efforts with a dedicated website, the social media technology of the time, regional open town hall meetings, online questionnaires, an interim report, academic conferences, and partnering with civil society organizations, interest and participation in the Commission's work was low. We were of no doubt that we had done our own work thoroughly and fairly, but an electoral system is not the politicians' or parties' property. We felt strongly that a referendum was necessary to legitimize such a change. Our recommendation was for a double majority comprised of 50% plus 1 of votes cast by at least 50% of eligible voters in a binding province-wide referendum vote. To ensure fairness and impartiality in the referendum process, we recommended a new referendum act for the province with extensive provisions for governing such a process to be held at the time of the next provincial election. It contains spending and contribution limits, establishment of referendum committees, registration of groups, voter education, and a new independent Elections New Brunswick agency to administer it. We also recommended a Legislative Assembly study committee to review the new voting system after 2 elections and report any improvements that might be necessary. So, 2 conclusions from our work that may assist you in yours. First, FBTP has good features and is both familiar and legitimate to most voters. After all, we do accept election night results, and Canada has progressed. It does, however, have clear drawbacks and inadequacies that an MMP system could mitigate. MMP, we know, is more reflective of the democratic values of fairness, inclusiveness, choice, and equality of vote. But MMP at the national level has never really been modeled or analyzed in a comprehensive way that I've seen, except for one Law Commission of Canada report. There are real consequences, we found, and outcomes based on the specific design of that system that you will need to research and consider should you decide to recommend it. Second, public legitimacy of a new electoral system is highly desirable and surmounts party and politician interests. It is about the citizen and voter in a citizen-centered democracy. A referendum is the simplest, clearest, and most acceptable way of conferring legitimacy for the long term, not just on the system, but more importantly, on the outcomes it produces. I know this is contentious, so let me offer a second best, but perhaps still viable option to you. Provide for a validating referendum after 2 elections based on a parliamentary review of the system and giving Canadians the chance to accept it, perhaps with improvements, or revert back to the previous system. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you for the invitation and for listening.
Merci, M. McLaughlin. Alors, on va poursuivre avec...
Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. And now Mr. Scott, please.
It's good to be back. If I'd known I was coming, I'd have baked a cake, which is to say I would have sent a paper. But I have it and I'll send one afterwards. Just to situate you briefly, yes, I did work on this file when I was a parliamentarian, and I think the culmination in terms of what went on in Parliament was an Opposition Day motion in December 2014, specifically to test the waters on not continuing with winner-take-all electoral systems, and specifically to endorse mixed-member proportional representation adapted to Canada. The vote didn't pass, but it is noteworthy to know that 16 of the 31 Liberal MPs voting that day did vote with the motion. So I think we have the basis for the kind of cross-partisan, pan-partisan discussion that this committee is clearly all about. Let me start by explaining in brief several reasons mixed member proportional deserves to be at the top, or at the top along with one or two other proportional models. The standard reason you've all heard of is it's the best of two worlds reason, which is that those two principles from the committee's mandate, the called effectiveness and legitimacy, but effectively it's the fair translation of votes into seats principle and the local representation principle, are both attended to by the model. The second two I want to point out are less commonly noted. One, the one I have been beating like a dead horse for the last 3 years, but others don't seem to talk about it as much. I think MMP takes local MPs and local candidates much more seriously than any other form of PR, and more than first past the post. And that's because of the potential for crossover voting. Voters can vote, tick local representative and vote for candidate X, who happens to be from a certain party, and go over to the regional MP lists, go into the list, decide which party they want to support and which person on the list, if it's flexible, and they don't have to be from the same party. I think that has salutary impacts. In New Zealand, around 30% take up that option of cross-voting. And what it means is that the local candidates are more likely to be able to attract votes for who they are, what they've done, what they can bring nationally from the local level, without people having to worry about the strategic vote. I think it's an extremely important feature of MMP. The second thing is maybe, it's almost heresy to say, but I think the idea of having a coterie of regional MPs alongside the purely local MPs has a salutary impact on national politics. It already is taking a bunch of MPs away from the purely local. They're going to have to look a little bit more broadly at the dynamics in a bigger area than a local riding. I believe, after 3 years on the Hill, that we have a deficit when it comes to a national capacity to focus on national issues in our Parliament. It's far too localized by virtue of the system of 338 ridings set alongside each other that somehow then has to generate a national politics. And so I think there would be some added benefit from MMP that way. Some of the problems from the current system deserve to be highlighted because I think MMP does address them, as would any serious PR system. One is the diversity of viewpoints problem. When you have false majorities, you have less of a true diversity of the range of voters' opinions. You have a serious problem of lack of diversity of viewpoints coming from regions. So right now, Atlantic Canada is represented by well, albeit a fairly large tent party, but nonetheless one party. Toronto has gone without representatives other than one party. When the NDP swept in Quebec in 2011, we had 80% of the seats with something like 42, 43, 44% of the vote. That was no fair for on our score than what's happened in many other contexts. It exacerbates regionalism because people tend to start associating, especially if that repeats itself over more than one election, with, Alberta is nothing but conservative, et cetera, et cetera. It also feeds into an unduly executive-dominated Westminster system of Parliament. The false majorities can give license to that power dynamic. It can produce tunnel vision and ideological fixations in legislation rather than forcing legislation to have to encounter different points of view that the product of proportional representation elections tends to produce, and our false majority system doesn't. And I believe that it also, we have a system that tends, and it can be exacerbated in different points in time, tends away from consensus and collegiality and towards adversarialism and hyperpartisanship, almost a gridiron-style politics that is tied a bit to the winner-take-all dynamic and the organizing for the next election on those same terms. Alternative vote is a ranked ballot system within single-member districts that is on the table. It's, the Liberal Party has put it on the table in its own policy book from some time ago. And I just wanted to make sure that it's crucial that everybody knows that there's nothing about AV that would really counteract most or if any of these problems. The first thing is that although it is unpredictable, it's almost always the case that, at least to some extent, AV will exacerbate the problem of disproportionality. Eric Grenier for CBC, right after the last election, using available data, suggested that something like 224 Liberals would have been elected instead of the 185 or so that were elected under the current system. But beyond that, even on its own terms, AV is presented as a majoritarian system, and I want to make sure everybody understands the limitations to that characterization. How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
You have about 3.5 minutes.
Okay. First of all, it's not really majoritarian in the sense of a majority of first preferences. For many of the ridings, you have to add second preferences. That's the first thing that everybody has to note. The second thing is that it doesn't even make sense of the notion of making every vote count, which was the top line in the government's platform in the last election. For years, we all assumed that expression of making every vote count really referred to proportional representation. But it's clear that if it was used in the Liberal platform, it had to have been meant to possibly do service to keep open the possibility of alternative vote. But that can't be the case when AV doesn't actually count every vote equally. It's not just what happens is that when you count the second votes, you're only counting from the bottom up until somebody crosses the 50% threshold. You almost never get to counting the second votes of the first and second place candidates after the first round. So it's actually a false presentation of making every vote count. And I would say that there's also kind of a deceptive majority problem. I'll send you the chart where I've done the work on this, but you can actually get candidates crossing the threshold of 50% plus one in first plus second votes, while if you added up all of the first and second place votes, including those for the top two candidates, that candidate would not be the preference. So it's a system that has benefits, but you have to be very careful to know what they are and not falsely sort of say this is about a majoritarian system. It's really not a majoritarian system of great consequence. I'll end by saying that I spent 3 years as official opposition critic for democratic reform, making the case for PR, and the NDP's position was MMP. That was arrived at after the NDP studied it in the early 2000s. There have been various commissions across the country, including the one really well outlined by Mr. McLaughlin in New Brunswick, the positive experience abroad in Scotland, New Zealand, Germany, for example, my own review. So I do believe MMP is the ideal. But I want to emphasize that principled and respectful compromise can do the job too. And it's central already to your work. I would, for example, urge this committee to consider the UK Jenkins Commission idea of MMP allowing ranked ballot voting on the local election side. You'd have to make sure that you don't have a split between local and regional seats that unduly favors the local election side, because the ranked ballot could produce greater distortions at that level. But if there are folks in the room that say there is an independent benefit to ranked ballot voting for local elections, it can be built in. Similarly, I also believe you can design a single transferable vote system that would allow for a degree of local attention. You can divvy up ridings, multi-member district ridings for service functions. You can have coordinated delivery of services, even though all the MPs represent the entire riding. You can approximate a form of local attention with STV. So there are ways to compromise and get to multiple goals. I'd end by saying, and there's many other institutional design features that I'm happy to take questions on, but I'd end by saying, I think this committee started extremely well. Minister Monsef's introduction, where she talked about two mischiefs, not one. She talked about the problem of false majorities. She also talked about why an alternative vote style system might address another set of problems. She wasn't exclusive. And the composition of this committee has, I think, given a jump start to something that many doubted would ever be possible. And there's lots of folks out there, naysayers, commentators, who are assuming that behind the scenes, not from the members of this committee, but behind the scenes, one of the goals is for this all end up as a big noble failure. And that there will be a deadlock, an impasse, nothing will come out of it, we'll keep the current system. I don't think that has to happen. I have a skeptical optimism that I believe we can do much better, and I believe you're starting because this very committee is formed in a way that proportional representation would form committees in the future. If you guys can do it, it will itself be proof that a system can work like this in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. On passe maintenant à Monsieur Fox.
And now it's Mr. Fox's turn. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee for this invitation to come speak to you today. Since the very beginning of the hearings, the committee has met with a number of experts who have testified on the characteristics of various voting systems and the experiences with them in other countries and their applicability or lack thereof in Canada given our geographic realities and demographic realities in our political system. These considerations are, of course, very important, but for my presentation this morning, I will rather highlight the committee's mandate, the deliberative process, and the involvement of citizens in this debate, which can have all sorts of consequences for our system, democratic, desired, or otherwise. And although this was not coordinated, I will echo a number of the points that Mr. McLaughlin and Scott have already raised this morning.
Engaged in this deliberative process is so critically important to any eventual proposal for reform and to the legitimacy that that proposal will have in the eyes of voters. It is exponentially more important that we get this right than that we get it done on time.
With respect to the consultative tools that have already been announced, I congratulate the committee for its efforts to multiply the opportunities to express opinions on this issue. Your decision to hold meetings across the country and the availability of an online questionnaire are obviously great ways to allow those who wish to have their voices heard. That being said, it is an opportunity to express a point of view, but to develop a large consensus among voters, which in my opinion is essential to the success of a long-term reform, we must also create opportunities for sharing, dialogue, and progress.
Currently allows for the articulation of interests, but it is less clear how those varied and sometimes competing interests will be aggregated into a public consensus on the best way forward. Canadians should have as many opportunities as possible to state their views, but a genuinely deliberative process should also capture the changing of views as individuals hear from others or consider new evidence. As elected representatives of the people, members of Parliament can certainly support that process by staying connected to the evolving views of their constituents and reflecting them in their interventions in Parliament. But party policy and party discipline will put limits on their ability to do so freely if constituents have views that differ from that of their party. Legitimate limits, perhaps, but limits nonetheless. On an issue of such fundamental importance to the democratic system, Canadians themselves must participate meaningfully in the debate, and their collective wisdom must drive the outcome. Thus, the question that came to me as I was considering this process was, how do we graduate from public consultation to citizen engagement? And with this in mind, I'd make the following observations for the committee's consideration. First, I'm not sure the average voter really knows what problem we are trying to fix yet. Every voting system comes with distortions and flaws, but what is it precisely about the outcomes of single-member plurality that we think are deficient? This very point in the public's mind, that alternative voting systems would yield more desirable outcomes, is in itself a matter of contention. The committee's mandate is to make recommendations to the House, but should the government, based on the committee's advice, decide to produce a bill, public leadership will be required to ensure there's broad support for the intention of reforming the electoral system, which I humbly submit does not currently exist. In order to achieve any measure of consensus on reform, we must first ensure that there's common agreement that there is a problem to be fixed and a common understanding of what that is. Bien sûr, je reconnais que le comité a reçu un mandat.
Of course, I recognize that the committee received a very specific mandate and a framework in which it must operate. But it is perhaps possible in your discussions and your written materials to remind decision makers that the pedagogical dimension of this debate is essential to any future work. Information modules on the reform options that the committee has made public are very useful, but it would possibly also, but public leadership from the government may also be possibly necessary to ensure that this reform is necessary, to convince citizens that this reform is necessary and priority. Secondly, the committee's mandate lists the principles or values that any electoral reform proposal should support or strengthen. Effectiveness and legitimacy, participation, accessibility, integration, and local representation. In my opinion, this mandate is correct in that the correct principles have been identified. The work that remains to be done is public debate on the prioritization of these 5 principles in case of conflict between them. As citizens, do we prefer to sacrifice a bit of local representation to increase the participation of groups that are currently underrepresented? Or do we prefer a voting system that protects the link between the elected official and his or her territory at any cost? The 2 options are defendable, but we need to have a common response.
Outline in the committee's mandate that the public debate should be centred, at least in the initial phase. And the eventual debate on the mechanics of voting systems should be based on how we collectively feel about these values and how we've agreed to resolve the conflicts among them if and when they arise. A common understanding of the relative importance of these values for Canadians will also ensure that the eventual choice on voting system can be assessed against a public declaration of shared values rather than tactical partisan interests. And on this specific issue of designing the engagement exercise, either as part of this process or any subsequent legislative process if a bill does indeed come to Parliament, I'd encourage the committee to reach out to expert practitioners such as Don Lenihan, who've direct experience working on engagement exercises within parliamentary and government processes. And as a final observation, and echoing a point that Professor Scott made, I want to reflect on the composition of this committee and the choice that was made to ensure that it was more reflective of the popular vote than the makeup of the House of Commons. In an important way, that makes this committee a prototype of the typical committee of a House of Commons elected under a more proportional system. L'un des principes énumérés.
One of the principles listed in the committee's mandate seeks to encourage collaboration in political processes. The committee composition opens the possibility to going above and beyond the recommendations and to make a demonstration of this in conducting your work.
Back to the House will be instructive as to how Parliament under a new system would behave. You have the opportunity to foreshadow what electoral reform might yield. Process, in this case, is content. The political sensitivity of the issues you must consider may increase the risk of trying to achieve consensus among you, but the signal it could send may also increase its rewards. In contrast, a result that is more akin to the expected majority report by MPs from the governing party and dissenting reports from all the others may be less encouraging to those who hope that a change in the electoral system will bring more collaboration to our politics. And on that specific point, let me say that, like Professor Scott, I think the committee is off to a really terrific start on that front. Alors sur ce, Monsieur le Président, merci beaucoup de votre invitation.
Thank you very much for your invitation once again. I wish you all the best, and it would be a pleasure to have discussions with you and to answer your questions. Thank you, Mr. Fox. So we will start the first round of questions with Mr. Aldag. For 5 minutes, please.
This is for, again, some wonderful testimony, lots to think about. As I listen to the 3 of you, you've all provided some excellent additional insights, things that I'm mulling over. But I'm going to start by taking a step back. And part of it's triggered by a discussion from one of our panels yesterday about, is this the right time for change? And I'd like to pose that question to the 3 of you. We're not in a crisis situation right now. The comment was made, the crowd's not marching, protesting by torchlight, and so, do we actually need to wait for that kind of crisis in our system to do it, or, are we at the right timing? And so I throw it to each of the 3 of you to offer your comment. Is this the right time for this discussion, or, I've heard some general support for us continuing on this discussion, but it seems to be that we don't have a crisis facing us. So, is there a crisis? And I think it goes to comments, Mr. Scott or Fox, that you made about anyway. Is change needed now? So I throw it out to any or all of you.
I'll start by saying I think it's probably in general not great public policy to wait for crises. And so that's the first answer. The second is there's been a slow build up to this. It's not as if it's coming out of the blue. It's been since the early 2000s right till now. We've had a number of different commissions and processes in different provinces, even at the federal level with the Law Commission of Canada. And so there's something to be said for slow boiling cumulative politics that produces where we're at now. And the third thing, and which is kind of what can tend to happen a little bit in more consensual parliamentary processes, they might take a bit longer for the same reasons. The third thing is something called electoral promises. If we take seriously the very fundamentals of our electoral democracy feeding into the parliamentary system, it was a pretty high-profile promise on the part of the government to start this kind of process. At least two other parties had more specific ideas, but obviously were open to the bigger discussion about what kind of electoral reform. So I think there is a popular mandate. People vote for all kinds of reasons and all kinds of dynamics, but we would be throwing out the window the idea of party platforms and the worth of electoral promises if we didn't take this one quite seriously.
Okay. Mr. Fox.
In support of what Professor Scott just said, I think it is precisely because there is no imminent crisis that this is that this kind of work needs to happen now. But I would add to that it emphasizes the importance of the public education and bringing voters and citizens along as a necessary component of a successful process.
Okay, and Mr. McLaughlin.
I would concur with both Craig and Graham and what they said, but I would offer this bit of dissent. I think your job, frankly, is more difficult because there is no imminent crisis or sense of need to get at this right now that concentrates the public's minds on it. Part of your task is to, while you study various systems and look for improvements, as you should as parliamentarians, is also convincing Canadians of the need for change. Graham said at the outset about what's the problem we're trying to fix. I do believe you still have to spend some time communicating that and putting it in terms that people can relate to. It is worth casting ourselves back to the previous commissions. At the time that we did New Brunswick, along with others, there were very specific electoral outcomes that were driving the debate. As I mentioned, New Brunswick, big majority government, small oppositions. That was bothering people, and so that animated our conversation. In BC, the Citizens' Assembly, they went from one extreme to the other. Gordon Campbell won almost every seat. In Quebec, Jean Charest and the Liberals had won the majority vote, but lost the legislative vote, lost the election. So these things do get in people's minds a sense that the system isn't fair. So right now, because there isn't that sense across the country, I would argue, and that post the last election, your task is a little bit more difficult, and you'll have to, frankly, find some ways to get it on people's minds. But part of the way you do your work, it'll work for you in two ways. One, the way you do your work, the consultative process, the engagement, but it's also the quality of your work and the recommendations that you come out with.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Reid now.
Thank you very much. All the presentations were excellent, but I have to focus my questions on one person, so it'll be on Professor Scott. So first of all, let me say, Craig, it's a pleasure having you back here.
Great to see you too, Scott.
We sat on a committee together during Craig's entire period as a parliamentarian, and I thought he was one of the most thoughtful people we had ever had on that committee, and that's high praise because, among others, Ed Broadbent has sat on that committee at one point. So,
thank you.
Having said that, I wanted to ask you. No, I said. Well, I wanted to turn to substance, actually. I agree with your analysis of alternative vote. I think you're entirely correct in how you describe it. I think it has an additional problem in Canada, and that is that unlike most first-past-the-post systems, Canada has had, where you tend to get a party of the right and a party of the left battling it out, and you get a government of the left or the right alternating. In Canada, we've tended to have a party of the center governing, and the Liberals therefore have a systemic and predictable advantage under the AV system. Harold Jansen, who appeared before us, pointed out that both in the 2015 election, their best election in 3 decades, and in the 2000 election, the worst election ever for the Liberals, they get more seats under alternative vote than under the status quo. I asked about previous studies, previous elections. He said one had been done in 1997, which confirms the same thing, and I've since looked up that study. So it appears to be the case that, given our party structure, that perhaps not forever, but at least for the next election, this produces a predictable result, and that is significant because you could get a smaller percentage of the vote than they got this time, still get a majority under AV, therefore get 100% of the power, and in fact, this is the opposite of the kind of proportionality that I think we're looking for. So having said that, I now move on to your discussion of MMP. Again, my sense from what we've heard from witnesses is that MMP tends to work better in the Canadian context than the other proportional models, for reasons that I won't go into, or else I'll do all the talking. But you mentioned a model that was recommended by the Jenkins Commission that involves proportionality through a list and then has alternative vote at the riding level. And you say it had merit, or you say you think it may have some merit. I'll read the Jenkins Commission report in due time, but the concern I have under this system is that if we implemented it here, one party, the Liberals, would get all of the, or vast majority of the riding votes, and the list seats would therefore go to the other parties. And this would produce, at the very least, an odd balance in Parliament. It might not be the end of the world, but I want to ask you if that strikes you as being a problem, given the nature of Canada.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a problem. That's why I very hurriedly ended my comments by saying you'd have to be very careful about the distribution of local versus the regional list seats, because you're going to get even at least as much, if not greater, distortion of the number of seats won by a party that's favored by AV at the front end. And so, for example, if one said the Law Reform Commission's, without recommending AV as the way to vote on the local side, just first past the post for the local elections, recommended 65-35, or roughly 2/3, 1/3. If you kept that proportion and went to AV, it wouldn't be good enough. You'd have to at least go down to 60% in order to account for that extra distortion for the reasons that you're saying. I'm offering it out there as a position that would still have to be fought for. People would still have to say, what is it about AV other than what I'm calling relatively unclear and not entirely accurate claims about majoritarianism? What else is it about AV that people think is fixing something? And if that case is made and somebody wants to go in that direction, you can still build it in to MMP. That's really my only point. It's not the first place I would go, because I think it makes the proportionality side harder to achieve.
I've about 20 seconds left, so just quickly, we heard a very good presentation yesterday from some German officials suggesting, or professors, suggesting we should have a 50-50 split list seats versus riding seats. Given a choice of where you'd put the marker in, what percentage would you pick?
Briefly, please.
I tend to use 60-40 just because of, it's almost a political guess too. I actually do believe that because proportionality is my first stop in terms of design, I think the German system comes much closer to ensuring it. So 50-50 is recommended for a reason by them, but 60-40 I think would be the top that I would go in terms of a split.
Thank you. Mr. Cullen.
I'm kind of a 70-30 guy myself, but we can have that argument later. I don't know if any of you have read the Andrew Coyne piece from yesterday. Stability we talked about effectiveness of government. One of the things that government needs to be effective is predictability, that they can have a 2, 3, 4-year mandate like typical. Although 9 out of 20 of the last elections, candidates have put forward a minority parliament, which under first past the post is very unstable, because there's an incentive from somebody at any point to bring the government down. Yet when we've looked through the global experience of majoritarian first past the post versus proportional governments, there's actually slightly more stability on the proportional government side, because there isn't that same incentive under that system to bring the government down. Is anything what I've said so far wrong in the analysis, Mr. Fox or Mr. Scott, because we're both?
Not in my view. I think it's a compelling argument.
by the time we were doing our work, we found actually a bit of the opposite, and I do recommend, if you're interested, we had some academic research conducted, which we published in a book, and many of these academics you've seen here. So some of it may be dated, but we did some original analysis to show where the effects on government formation and instability. And at that time, 2003, 2005, proportional PR government seemed a bit more unstable, but I know you've had some subsequent research that maybe it's changed a bit, but I do.
Yeah, we looked at some OECD sort of 60-year longitudinal study type of thing.
So I think the bottom line is the two systems on stability measures of length of between elections and length of governments are actually quite similar, where there's actually a tiny edge on these long-term longitudinal studies for PR systems, but not statistically significant. But a lot of the studies that might have been taken into account back in the early 2000s were throwing Italy in. And what were effectively cabinet shuffles were treated as government changes.
Right.
And that actually skewed some statistics.
So when the cabinet would shift, it was recorded as government just changed.
That's a change of government.
But the voters' experience is what I'm interested in this entire conversation. And I want to go back to you, David, about this in terms of the recommendations you made in New Brunswick about treating votes equally, regardless of where they're cast. You've joined some other folks because we've got this legitimacy question as well. How do we legitimize what's going on here? I hear in different ways from all three of you a responsibility, a test put to us as a committee, that this composition, which is closer to a reflection of how Canadians voted, this committee, and whether this committee can function. So far, so good. The idea of testing a new voting system after it's put in place has been supported by some and decried by others. David, you suggested support for today. How come?
It's the starting point for me is that it's the public system. It's not the party system, or it's not a politician systems and whatnot, all that. I mean, so leaving, that's the starting point. I think also our sense of democracy has changed over time in terms of what people are expecting from elected officials. It's unfortunate, but we don't hold a high enough opinion of them yet to devolve upon them all of these kinds of decisions. And while I think elected officials through this process can very much inform the way people think and help them, with the options, I just have a strong sense that in this country that we will not, as citizens, sort of give up that opportunity or that right, as we perceive, in order to cast a vote one way or the other on it.
So you talked about, Craig, you talked earlier about tunnel vision and policy. We had Mr. Broadbent here earlier suggesting, if you went back in time, we've had many governments form in Canada with very poor representation from all the regions. Previous Liberal governments with almost no representation in the West. His contention was it led to some bad energy policy. We've had Conservative governments with the opposite, very strong Western base, but virtually nothing in Quebec over much of time. The balance of those interests and regional interests under a proportional system, some see that as a diffusion of focus for a government, a lessening of the strength of the policy that comes forward. How would you argue against that?
Very, very briefly, please. I'll be very brief, which is I think insight and legitimacy comes from diversity. If you have a serious interaction of diverse points of view in a good faith climate, you come to better policy.
Thank you. Monsieur Thériault.
Oui. Alors, merci beaucoup, messieurs.
Thank you very much. We at the Bloc Québécois believe that we need to change things, but not in any old way. We need to break out of the bubble of experts and political parties. We're starting from the premise that this portfolio is overly determined by partisanship. Although this committee is proportional, it is also too partisan. That's why we believe that there needs to be a second step to this process. We need to bring Canadians back to the center of this reform initiative. If I understand correctly, you agree.
I have a sense that this committee is actually that partisan. I do have a sense that it is, it's proportional, and the parties are doing their work, and members of Parliament are doing the work. So, with that, slight dissent, I do believe that, and did offer up that a referendum, a chance for citizens and voters to pronounce on the work of this committee, and more, I guess more fundamentally, a government motion, a bill that would go to the, into the House of Commons through the parliamentary process, is the most legitimate, is the way to bring the most legitimacy to the eventual outcomes of the process.
Monsieur Scott ou
Oui,
Monsieur Fox?
Oui, je dirais aussi qu'il y a.
Would also say that there's an education element to all this, as Mr. Fox said. It's not necessarily about there being overmuch partisanship. It might more be a matter of whether or not the public is paying attention to what's happening here. And Mr. Scott, do you not believe that when a government or parties are implementing a reform, don't you think that parties tend to want to favor their own partisan interests? After all, no politician is going to be completely indifferent to that. Since none of the systems is completely perfect, everyone agrees that there are advantages and disadvantages. The ultimate decision needs to rest in the hands of the people. Mr. Fox. And that's why I believe that a debate on values and principles is so important. Because even if we hold citizen assemblies and so on, but if we immediately start debating the mechanics of the election system and pit one system against another, but if we haven't come to a consensus about the ideological underpinnings of the system, then we will not come to a satisfactory conclusion. So we need to come to an agreement about the principles that we hold dear, and then we can see whether specific proposals measure up to those values, rather than to various partisan positions. And if we did adopt a mixed member proportional system, don't you feel that while we change the mechanics of the system, we also need to change funding mechanisms for parties, because we can't support ideological plurality without giving each of those voices financial support in the House. And don't you also believe that parliamentary procedure should be updated so that MPs cannot find themselves in the situation where the Bloc Québécois is currently? Well, I wouldn't like to make any specific comment about the issue of funding for political parties, but once we've cleared up this current debate a little bit, I think we're going to need to set it within a wider context of governance. And what does it mean to the federal system to have, for example, more coalitions in Ottawa versus the provinces who might not have chosen the same system? And funding is related to all that. But the main goal here is not about governance. The main goal here is plurality within the legislative system, which is the very heart of democracy.
Again, particularly, you said in your opening, Craig, that if you'd known you were coming. For those who are watching who don't know, you were able to sub in at the last minute for a witness who suddenly canceled, and I don't know how many of you are in the same boat. I'm very grateful to have this panel this morning. I want to start with you, David, about the experience of the New Brunswick Commission. I have a question from Twitter that came from Laurel Russworm. And she wants to know if you think New Brunswick should have implemented the recommend. I mean, it's a tough question. You put a lot of work into it. Do you wish, in hindsight, that the MMP had been brought in New Brunswick?
Yes, because it would have been brought in by a Conservative government that had been re-elected. So.
Excellent.
No, the commitment by Premier Lord was that if he had won the next election, it would have gone ahead. But there was a change of government, and the new Liberal government said no. So,
yeah. And in terms of your focus, I'm very gratified by the focus that you've brought here, that you used in the Commission, of a more citizen-led democracy. I've been trying to figure out how we as parliamentarians, because I see us around this table first and foremost as parliamentarians and not as some sort of proxy units for large political parties. That's the way we'll come to consensus here, is operating as parliamentarians, that we have to somehow disengage the notion of a voting system that serves political parties and focus on a voting system that serves the interests of voters to feel their vote counts. So your focus, how in practice did that lead you to MMP? And I'll ask the same question of Craig and Graham, if I may. How do we as parliamentarians dislodge ourselves, and this is, or at least communicate to Canadians that our job here is to act in the interests of Canadian democracy and for voters?
It led us to MMP with the broader mandate that we had with those other principles too, effective government, quality of the vote, etc. But when we had to make certain trade-offs, looking at certain systems, we looked at AV, we looked at STV, we studied Germany, New Zealand, all of the same kinds of models. But for a specific example, we knew then New Brunswickers were really quite keen and fond of having their local MLA. And so losing that connection would have undermined that citizen focus, if you will. So we put that in there. We also had issues, we had recommendations with respect to how parties could reform themselves, and that getting a bit at some of the issues that Mr. Theriault raised. So again, we wanted more transparency in the process. We thought a two-vote system was not complicated. Everybody can count to two. But we actually thought, if the citizen focus, that a more complicated system with large ballot sheets and that might actually not be the best thing for voters. So it began with principles, Elizabeth, but then as we worked through the various design elements, it helped us make some of those choices. Final point, parties are legitimate actors in this system. And so fairness to parties, in a way, is not something you can absolutely discount. But if it's all about parties, and if it's seen to be about parties, then you have lost your way, but also the system will have lost its way.
Craig, do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, maybe a slightly tangential comment, just because I didn't get it in my main comment, which is that if we're going to take seriously Canadians in the way that you've outlined so well, we also have to bring into the discussion at the institutional design level a few other questions. The question of gender has to be really quite central. For example, if you went to an MMP system, would the zippering of the list, where every second person on the list for any given party must by legislation be a woman, would something along those lines make sense as well, given where we're at in our collective understanding of 150 and going years in relationships with Aboriginal peoples? I think those two factors, along with other less represented communities, you have to somehow figure out. It's not the generic people only. It's you have to think about Canada as it is, and figure out what elements can be built in that aren't overly complicating.
I think I have 20 seconds left for your comment, Graham.
Not to be too cute, but find more time. I think a pan-Canadian Citizens Assembly is probably unworkable given geography and those things, but I think there are other ways that you can build a process. But if you're going to follow the principle that you first need to define before you discuss and before you decide, you're going to need more time.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Romanato.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank our three witnesses today for coming in on a sunny September 1st now. Wow, it's been a long summer. Mr. Fox, you mentioned something that another witness, or we've heard from a few witnesses, have said to us, and it's kind of sticking out now, that what is the problem we're trying to solve? And for us, it's very evident. But we heard yesterday testimony that only really 3% of Canadians are actively engaged in this process. And so looking at the process that we've put in place so far, should we be doing something before we go out on our roadshow of sort of a situational analysis? What should we be doing to make sure that folks understand what that problem is we are trying to solve? And what would be the best way to do that, if you could elaborate?
I think the idea of trying to take stock of the advice and testimony that you've heard before you go on the road is actually quite an interesting one. And it may be that behind closed doors, all members of the committee have come to a common definition of the problem. I'm not aware of that. But certainly, if you could all sign on to a common articulation of what it is that you think you're trying to fix, that would make the process progress tremendously. And I think there's also an interesting signal in that if this committee can come to a common articulation of the problem, then it makes it easier for Canadians to reflect on it and say, well, do I agree with this, yes or no? As opposed to trying to grow a common understanding organically as you're traveling the country. You'd be at this for 18 drafts and you might not get to a final one.
Okay. Now, we heard a little bit from Mr. McLaughlin on, you said the one value that wasn't included, the effective government. My colleague mentioned it as well. In terms of prioritizing the values or principles, what are the things that Canadians may be willing to trade off? Because we've heard there is no perfect system to address all the issues that we have in our electoral reform mandate. What should we be doing to make sure that we capture the proper information that will give us that idea of what are Canadians absolutely what's non-negotiable versus, okay, you know what, I could live without that. What would you recommend?
I'm going to riff a bit off what Graham Fox said in terms of putting some stuff out there that people can react to. We did that in the New Brunswick Commission. We had an options paper. We had some draft recommendations. We put things out to try to narrow the debate in terms of getting people to respond to specific things to help us come to conclusions and decisions. I do commend that, whatever the equivalent would be for you folks to do something similar. An example of the trade-offs is proportionality, pure proportionality versus effective government. So, a pure PR system, designed willy-nilly, will lead you to issues of stability and the rest of it. And so, there's an example of it. So, how far are people prepared to go? They will list these things as their values, and they will want to have them reflected as much as possible. And that's the dilemma, as much as possible. So 2 words, design matters. The design of your system in terms of what kinds of outcomes it produces will have a real impact on how much of one value or principle is reflected or not. I think Canadians would be willing to let a committee like this, hearing from experts, help shape that, as long as they see that the core principles are in there. And since there is no ideal system, there is no best system, it is by definition going to be a choice of trade-offs. But the sooner that you are able to put out to people something about your thinking, something about shaping the conversation in a way that allows you to get a better handle on it, I think the more productive your work will be. Short answer, there's lots of specifics you can do in there, but something along those lines would be, I think, useful.
Okay. Mr. Scott, do you have any suggestions?
I think what Mr. McLaughlin said was absolutely correct.
Okay, good. Mr. Richard.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate you all being here today. Good to see you again, Mr. Scott. As Mr. Reid said earlier, you and I had this opportunity to sit in that committee together as well. I kind of feel like we're playing musical chairs because I think you sat actually right in this chair exactly where I am.
That chair.
I was over there, and I don't think either one of us ever thought we'd be sitting over there where you are. So, but welcome back.
Forced retirement has its virtues, don't worry.
So I think I'm going to start, though, with you, Mr. McLaughlin. You made a comment in the Globe and Mail in May, and I'm going to quote it short on, the process here is short on principles, short on timing, and short on legitimacy. Now, I think a lot of people in the room would be surprised to hear that I want to focus on the timing part of that quote. And you went on in that article to say that the 5 provinces that did this each took about 2 years to do it, not 6 months, and each proposed a 2 or 3 step process involving the legislature, independent commissions, or citizens' assemblies, and in 4 cases a referendum. So what I'd wanted to focus on is, because I think that the Liberal promise in their campaign, there's almost 2 competing parts to it that we have to grapple with at this point now. And the first was obviously the clear statement that the next election, or this election, will be the last one under the first past the post system. But I think there's also an implication in the statement that is made, setting up a parliamentary consultation process, that they made that statement that they would be doing. And I think there's an implication in that it would be a thorough process that would involve proper consultations. And I think we're coming to the point where we're starting to realize here that those 2 things are competing and may not be possible to accomplish both. And so I guess my question to you would be, which part of that promise is more important to keep? Is it more important to keep the part of the promise that the next election not be conducted under first past the post, or is it more important to make sure the process is thorough and that there's a proper consultation and that we get this right? So is it more important to do it quickly or to get it right?
Get it right.
And
I didn't make the promise, but I do believe, though, that there is great merit in studying our electoral system, and I am open, as somebody who has studied it, but also as a voter citizen, I'm open to change for it. I do see the inadequacies of the system, and I'm not, I don't want to stand on ceremony here, but I do think that you've got to allow a process that is inclusive enough, expansive enough, and timely enough. Give yourself some more time, if you can, to get this, to get your own deliberations right. I do feel December 1st is rushed. I know you're working very hard and harder than Canadians perhaps recognize and appreciate. But there you are. At the end of the day, my point is that it's still Canadian system, and we want to know that this work has been done. We want to know that we have a chance to reflect on it, and we also want to know what are the consequences of the change. We get the consequences of no change, status quo, life goes on. We have managed it, but the consequences of change, if they are not illuminated, if they are not brought forward in some way, then I think you will have a lot of explaining to do. But I think that's unfair to our democracy, to our society. So I would absolutely encourage you to take more time, and I know that then does impinge upon the timing for the next election, but we gave ourselves 2 elections in New Brunswick. Everybody, the evidence is there. Everybody who has made fundamental change has either, given themselves time or has at least allowed a safety valve, if you will, of a referendum in terms of the people's vote to do that. We will accept the results of that referendum, I'm sure, even if it's squeezed in that time. And therefore, in the spirit of offering up something as a bench, perhaps a compromise solution, I suggested perhaps a validating referendum after we've had a chance to see the system. Canadians will want to know that they have a chance to opt out and not just be forced to opt in. And it's that distinction that I think you do have to, that I know you're wrestling with, and I don't think you've arrived at a satisfactory solution thus far, but you still have some time.
Okay. You have about 10 seconds.
Oh, 10 seconds. Okay, well, I guess we'll save the rest for the next round then.
Sorry about that, Mr. Richardson. Monsieur de Courcy.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci à nos 3 témoins.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all our witnesses for your comments and wisdom.
Ms. May's question, and I think it reminds us that we can't predict the outcome of elections. I know the election in 2006 was called early in New Brunswick, I assume with some thought of partisan advantage that turned out the other way, and it gives me an opportunity to, I think, clarify the record for my friend Mr. Reid, who I believe adds a lot to this conversation as well, and that is that Harold Jansen, yes, did opine that perhaps the AV system would lead to a certain result in perpetuity, but then came to this committee and essentially contradicted himself, saying, no, we can't predict the outcomes of elections not knowing what a different system will deliver to us and not knowing what other issues will be in play at that time. I do have a question about the process that I'll get to in my second question, but I want to talk to Mr. Scott about a comment you made about the importance of campaign promises. And I would say that that could be an arguable merit of the system now, is that parties deliver platforms, visions for how they want to steer the country. Voters vote hoping to see those commitments enacted. We've had some testimony that in different systems of PR, you muddle some of the campaign visioning or the platform visioning that takes place. That's one thing I'd ask you to comment on, and where you see the relative trade-off there and how we should present that to Canadians. The second one is about this idea of fairness and equality of the vote, and I'll agree that elements of PR allow for votes to be counted in fair ways. I wonder, have you seen any of the testimony from Dr. Maskins, who presented to us the idea of the majority rule, where effectively each winning candidate is preferred to all the other candidates in a particular riding? And do you think it would be fair to present both an MMP system as a way of achieving fairness in the vote, as well as this system when we speak to Canadians?
Yeah, the last one was interesting. I'm not sure I will have a good answer. The first one, I think you've seized on a very important structural issue, but we also can't indulge in myths, which is, yeah, there are platforms and there's promises, and people do vote hoping their party, with generally, for those who know what are in the platforms, would like to see. But people do know minority governments can happen in our current system, and we've already just briefly touched on how that can be a somewhat dysfunctional way of figuring out which campaign promises do get attended to and which don't, and what kind of compromises are made. If you have a system where people know in advance that campaign platforms do have to end up in some kind of a more compromising collegial environment, it might not be a bad idea to start pushing parties to be a little bit more clearer on exactly what their top priorities are, in a way that basically tells people what might happen if this party and this party start talking about a coalition government. I think there is an issue of not knowing exactly what to count on when two parties start talking together who haven't indicated in advance that they would form a coalition. In most PR systems, you do know in advance what the likely coalitions are going to be, not always, and that can play itself out in how the platforms get presented. But I think it's an important issue that more generally, I wrote something recently, more generally we have to be more attentive to how easily and how many promises we make in campaign platforms. I actually think we have a kind of a debased electoral process right now. The platforms are too huge, too unrealistic. And the second one, if the two can fit together and produce proportionality, and there's independent merit to this the majoritarian model that was being discussed, then I would never rule it out.
Thanks very much. Mr. McLaughlin, the question I want to ask you about, and maybe we'll explore it more continuing on the second round of questioning, is about the nomination process for list candidates that was proposed within your New Brunswick model. My read of it is you're trying to balance competing tensions of having the party be able to offer a diversity of candidates, as well as allow the electorate to see some transparency and openness in the way that those candidates were selected. Can you speak to the thought process or the conversation that took place in developing that list PR recommendation?
On va devoir revenir à la question.
We'll have to come back to that question later. Mr. Boulris. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses who are participating in this extremely dynamic study. And I'm glad to see Mr. Scott back here once more. If only you could have been here in my seat. Mr. Fox, you said something interesting earlier. You said that Canadians need to understand the problem in order to understand what the best solution is. That's very logical. It's true that there aren't many Canadians who get up in the morning and say to themselves, the first past the post system creates distortions, and maybe the single transferable vote system would be a partial solution, but it might create a problem in the Canadian context because of the difference between rural and urban regions. Yes, that doesn't happen very often. But people get the sense that their vote is being wasted. They don't necessarily make the mathematical calculations, but 9 million votes last time were not represented, are not currently being represented in Parliament. 21% of people on the island of Vancouver voted for the Liberals, and ultimately they haven't been represented in Parliament. The same thing for Conservatives and New Democrats who voted in the Maritimes region, and they're not representative. And so people say, why should I go out and vote if my vote isn't going to change anything? In 2008, when I ran for the first time and I wasn't elected, people said to me, why would I vote for you, Alexandre? You're not going to win. So people feel that there's no way for their vote to lead to consequences in the makeup of Parliament. How should we fix that problem, Mr. Fox? I agree that the person you described probably does not exist, and perhaps it's all for the best. But in general, this feeling of futility about votes, about their not being reflected in the results, for some, that means that certain political parties aren't reflected in certain regions. In other cases, certain demographic groups like youth or the elderly doesn't end up in Parliament. It can also be a question of gender, minority representation, linguistic, ethnic minorities, etc. So it's important to understand exactly what it means to say, my vote is wasted. And we all have a slightly different vision of what that means. The source of frustration can be different for different people. And depending on the type of frustration it is, people will have different opinions about the best electoral method. So I don't think it's a bad idea at all to concentrate on those basic matters of values before confusing people with a plethora of different election methods and all their mechanics. When it comes to minorities and groups, Mr. McLaughlin, you said something earlier. I'd like to get a bit more of an explanation on that, because you said that the mixed member proportional system could be beneficial for francophones in New Brunswick. What do you mean by that?
Was that the way that regional boundaries could be drawn under an MMP system could very much safeguard and protect communities of interest where you had significant minority language or communities located. That you could actually craft boundaries that had the largest population centers for francophone voters, and that in turn would ensure that changing the system would not result in a dilution, if you will, of the number of self-styled francophone MLAs in the legislature. That was an obvious concern in New Brunswick. It was amongst the commission members. We were equally balanced in terms of francophones and anglophones, and so it was a way to do it. And so our experience showed that changing the electoral system should not be a barrier to that. You could find ways to address it. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention because it's a key issue, I think.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We welcome Jean-Pierre Charbonneau here, and he shared the Quebec process and the review of the voting system there. There were fears from the Quebec regions that they would be less well represented in the National Assembly. Could MMP do the contrary if there are groupings of regional MPs? Mr. Charbonneau said it would force regional MPs to work together for people in the region. What do you think about this idea? Quite quickly, please. I'll maybe come back to that one.
I think, again, political culture will be so important. Transition will take time, but yes, the idea of regional MPs from different parties working together is real in Germany, for example. Although they have less of a service culture when it comes to their constituents than we do, so it's not tested the same way. Nothing precludes a very different way of interacting professionally as parliamentarians.
Thank you. Monsieur Reyes.
Bonjour.
Good morning to all three of you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. All of the ins and outs of the change to proportional representation MMP, as my colleague said earlier, people repeat regularly that their vote doesn't count. But yesterday, the representative of the Institut du Nouveau Monde said that there were components of a poll done that people said they might not go vote, either because they're too busy, they're not interested, or they have problems related to registration for youth, particularly cynicism, no knowledge of electoral issues, no parties interesting them, lack of confidence, they're out of their riding, health problems, and so on and so forth. I get the impression that the comment of saying that my vote doesn't count is more a result of the fact that our political party didn't necessarily win, and then that leads to certain frustration in making that type of comment depending on the various elections. Am I wrong when I say that? Because when we look throughout the world, the percentage of people who go vote regardless of the voting system in use is dropping. So changing the voting system will not necessarily create a direct correlation in people being more likely to vote. I think that there needs to be a change in culture or more education. And 3 young people came to talk to us yesterday, and they stressed the importance of civic education and about policy and so on and so forth. Am I right? I would like to hear your thoughts on that. I think you're not wrong to say that it's important to understand all of the reasons that lead to someone not voting. And it's true that there are some of those reasons that don't have much to do with the voting system. That being said, I think you could also say that in that list of reasons, there are still a good number of reasons tied to the voting system. But the point that you raise, which is important, you can't think that changing the voting system will be a panacea. There are other things that we can do to increase civic participation. So yes, I'm following you on that argument. Are there would you like to add anything further?
PR systems tend to have higher turnout, voter turnout. So I think that is probably reflective of a sense that the votes do count, but by itself, there are other it's probably insufficient as an explanation. There are other factors that go into play. We do know that voter turnout goes up when in a change election, for example, in this country. Why? Because people think their votes do count. There's something more at stake. I would presume. So even with an inadequate system in terms of equality of vote, people still come out to vote. So there are going to be a myriad of factors, but it's the motivation to vote that we're really talking about here, not the barriers. You will have to address them, barriers to vote and all those administrative things. We still have to make that work. But people will come out to vote if they think it matters, and if they think their vote counts in that kind of, you got to bring, that kind of integration of the issues. Electoral system will clearly make a play in it, because that sometimes a seat that just has always elects a Conservative, always elects a Liberal, always elects an NDP will always be an outlier. Parties and campaigns don't pay much attention to it, so we don't they don't send the incentives out to voters to come out to vote. It's contested seats, swing seats that parties focus on, and where voters get the education / information, the messaging to try to be incented to go out and vote, and sometimes then that results in a higher turnout.
I would only add that I think it's important to understand that the changing the electoral system and the 5 to 8% increase that creates for turnout by most studies isn't just about people knowing, my guy, my person can be elected more easily. They associate it with producing a better political process too. And I think part of the outreach to Canadians needs to talk about the connections between the electoral system and what Parliament and the House of Commons could look like that's reasonably projectable. Projectable, if that's a word you can reasonably project, would be different. And my experience in 3.5 years as an MP was that I think we underestimate how much people care about the way in which Parliament works and parliamentarians act. They may not be at the top of their list, but they care.
Thank you. Ms. Sahota.
My mind is going in 100 million directions right now, in which one I should take. Okay, well, Mr. Fox, you had raised the point about that the next step of our process, we should really go prepared to people with a main concern in mind, so that we feel a sense of urgency on this committee. The government feels a sense of urgency because they have made a commitment to look at this and to change it. So how do we get people to feel that sense of urgency? We've been talking about this issue for years and years, and we know there's issues at stake that are important to people, but how do we get them to understand? What would you think that are the main concern we should be addressing to people should be? I know that you were talking about whether we've discussed and come up with a main concern. I think we have many concerns, but we can't figure out how to get people concerned about this issue.
I'm not sure it's up to me to propose kind of an articulation of the problem, but on the process, though, if we knew how to get citizens engaged in the manner in which we all hope they would on all things at all times, political life would be considerably easier in Canada. It's a challenge we all face in a host of ways. But two things came to mind as you were putting your question that I think are important. The first one, and I think the committee again is off to a good start on that, is to deliberate in full view of the public. I think if you are genuinely not just genuinely open, but are seen to be open and doing things in full view, that helps. And I think a process that is explicit about the fact that you don't have a preconceived view about the outcome will also encourage different views from coming to come to your table. Not an imperfect answer, but it's the one I have now.
I wrote a piece for Graham's publication that actually offers up some suggestions as to how you might consult more and improve the process, and I do, you can look at that. But in short, I suggested things like that were done previously under the constitutional process, Joe Clark. A bigger conference, citizen conferences, if not a citizens' assembly. Independent academic research that the public could see, that you could put out to people and show that you're considering the trade-offs and considering the issues. Series of online things that you're starting to do. There are a number of things that you can do to engage people beyond just the traditional committee process. I would encourage you, if you're going to go down that path, to do it sooner rather than later, because of the time constraint, obviously, that you're working under, whether it's December 1st or even give yourself some more time. It's not a lot of time. But secondly, to really make that work, when do Canadians focus? When it matters, or when they think a decision is coming. Right now, you are fairly in a broad, expansive, learning mode. And at some point, you've got to be in a deliberation mode, and you're going to be deliberating about specific options or specific choices. At that point, I would really encourage you to go public with a shorter paper or some specifics to say, this is what we are thinking. This is where we are heading. It really does matter. Now we want your input on this, and then you've got to find some way, again, to get input on those specific things. But until you put something out that is more explicit, more specific, and more real to Canadians, then I think, it will be an interesting notion, but, everybody has other things to do. And, we've struggled with that in New Brunswick, even with a dedicated process as well, and we had lots of engagement in terms of the devices. It's still very tough. So that's an off-the-top-of-the-head recommendation, but feel free to read the piece as well if you like.
And all I would say quickly is get the Tragically Hip to do a bunch of town halls with this committee and then call the CBC. And you've got your engagement right there. I'm only half joking, which is, the CBC has started doing town halls outside of election cycles with the Prime Minister, for example, with a minister or two. And it's a completely legitimate thing to be approaching the public broadcaster about a completely pan-partisan parliamentary process and whether or not they might be interested in that dimension of your work in terms of publicizing through town halls.
Do I have any more time?
No, 10 seconds. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for that idea. It's a good one. On débute la deuxième ronde.
We'll start the second round with Mr. Aldag.
You'd made a statement about in the model that was developed that having the list MPs and the constituency MPs in the mixed member proportional model that you couldn't do both, and I'm curious about the reasons for that. We've heard from other witnesses in other jurisdictions that they allow that, so it's interesting that you excluded it, and I'm just wondering what the thinking was behind that.
And let me take advantage of this to perhaps answer Mr. DeCourcy's question as well about the closed list, so they all sort of come together.
Yes.
Why we chose the closed list was a feeling that if the lists were closed, then the parties would make a bigger effort to put more women, in particular, on the list. So that was a concern of the commission at the time, to try to increase the number of female representatives in the legislature. Secondly, we're concerned that open lists would result in real intra-party competition as candidates vied for share of voice relative to others in order to get on to move up the list and get votes, and therefore this would actually put parties in a position of being kind of overly competitive and would demean the political process a bit. And then the third part, perhaps peculiar to New Brunswick, was the sense that large population centres could overpower smaller communities. So if you had a list member from one city within, or bigger town within a community, then they would get more votes relative to others. There was a sense of unfairness. So those are the things that drove us there. That again, with that process, it's not a far leap, I guess, to say, okay, let's have let's not allow for the people candidates to go to be on lists as well as local member candidates. We were concerned about two things. I think one was this potential gaming of the system, that they would oh yeah, you got elected on the list. I saw you put your name there, but you got elected on the list. What was partly what was a concern to us was creating two-tier MLAs. And it's not a guarantee, but how you arrive in office or how you arrive in your legislature, your House of Commons, is, it does have a bearing on how colleagues treat you and react to you. And then potentially, more importantly, how citizens or constituents would react to you. So that was a feeling there, that it would be better from a non-gaming perspective, that the public would see the system as really fair. You chose this, you won, or you didn't win. End of story. But also because we had heard evidence at the time. Remember, the systems, especially in New Zealand, were relatively new, and we did hear evidence from talking to New Zealand folks about this sense of second class or first class, MPs or MLAs. So it was a way to try to address that. Over time, you guys work things out, in your daily business. But that was what was motivating us.
Okay, thanks. Still.
Mr. Scott, I think.
Oh, briefly, there's a political cultural dimension to it. In Wales, there was that kind of resentment to the point that they did try to have a rule along the lines of the New Brunswick proposal, and Westminster overrode it. In Germany, they basically almost force everybody to be running locally as well as being on the list. And apparently a high percentage of German members of their legislature serve in one or the other capacity over the course of their career. And one of the things it does produce, the German approach, is it actually gets people to understand that there isn't such a great difference between the two sets of MPs, and it produces more continuity. So some people would say, in a throw the bums out culture, that's not a good thing. I think in Canada we have, obviously I'm sitting on the wrong side of the table to be saying this, but in Canada we probably have too much turnover. We have probably the highest turnover in comparable legislative processes, and we could benefit from probably having more continuity, especially in collegial, consensual legislative environments. If people are constantly coming in high numbers who are completely new, you do lose something. So Germany has more continuity, and I think the being able to be on both is part of it.
Thank you. Mr. Reid.
Well, just following up with that, I agree with Craig's observation about the high turnover here. It's striking that, I've been here for 16 years and I'm one of the, 15 most senior people on Parliament Hill. If I were in the United States Senate, I would still be struggling to get a junior chairmanship of a subcommittee on something nobody wants to do. And I'd be surrounded by octogenarians who've been there since President Truman or something. Yeah. Or McKinley, maybe. Okay, so that actually is a realistic problem that exists for sure. I wanted to turn, going back to a theme that has just been discussed, but that may not have been addressed directly. And Mr. McLaughlin, in your presentation, right at the very end, you mentioned there can be design issues with how you design MMP. And what I thought I was hearing you say, but I'm not sure I was hearing you say it, so I want your confirmation, is that if this committee were to, for example, just recommend MMP, but give no specifics, that the government could then take it. The cabinet, after all, designs the system and produces a system which has a different outcome than that which might have been imagined, at least in some of its respects, in some respects that are significant from a partisan point of view, than what the committee thought it was sending to the government. But I may have misinterpreted that, so I want to see your comments.
Yeah, I would agree with your interpretation. That would be a concern. That's why we were tasked with recommending an electoral system that met certain principles, but we felt very strongly in our commission work that we had to spell out what that system would be and all the details, that we were charged with figuring it out, that the details do matter, that the potential for unintended consequences for the various actors in the system, all of whom are legitimate, needed to be thought through as best we could. And we had to come up with recommendations. In fact, frankly, where we could, we came up with precise legal text as a way to encourage both the government and the opposition to actually move it along. We didn't want to leave very much to chance that things would get muddled at the other end. So yeah, I think, to use your example, Mr. Reid, if you proposed MMP and had some rationale for it and gave no detail, I think you would be leaving yourself open for perhaps a different kind of system in important respects than what you contemplated or desired. So if you're going to do your work, do your work. Right? Do the detailed, heavy lifting in order to help move the process along.
It's perhaps unfair to push you further on this point, but I'm going to do it anyway. You can just say, no, that is illegitimate if you feel this way. Would it be your recommendation then, or would you accept that this is a good recommendation, that we ought to actually be working on selecting, if it's feasible, if there's enough of a consensus, selecting an actual model and then trying to fill in the details as part of a report?
Yes.
Okay.
I would very much encourage you that for a number of reasons. One is that's the only way, in my view, for this file to progress within at least a shot at your time frames, and I'll try to be respectful of that. Secondly, I think it would show Parliament working. I think it would show the committee process working, and I would argue you'd probably, as a group, find it more fulfilling in terms of having that kind of engagement and that kind of commitment. So, yeah, at a number of levels, absolutely.
Okay, and I have to ask this question because the committee has not made a decision to go in favor of one system versus another. Let's say, for the sake of argument, we were drifting in the direction of STV. Would you make the same recommendation as to trying to pin down the details?
Yes.
Okay.
Again, I think it's system agnostic on that. I mean, I have a preference, but in a way, but as does everybody. So I think you would have to show it, and you'd have to show how it would work. You start with principles, but people also want to know how it would work. I go back to the outcomes. I mean, in a way, you're doing a long game in a very short period of time. The long game is improved legitimacy of our governance and of our system, et cetera, and that will flow from the outcomes. If we get people, maybe at first they're kind of, I'm not so sure about this, but over time they grow accustomed to and like the system. That's a good change for the and good progress for the country. So the legitimacy of the outcomes and the details do matter. And frankly, the short period of time you have, if again you're proceeding on that, to give direction to Elections Canada, but also parties. I mean, how do you then organize yourself for an election campaign? How do you, I mean, just think of the questions that go back and forth to Elections Canada on funding rules and that from your local, campaign manager on things now where people supposedly know. They're volunteers, right? Your CFO is a volunteer, all of that stuff. Now you have a new system. Where's the boundary? Well, it used to be we voted at the church down the street. Wait a minute, this town is out, this town is in. All of those things will matter. Help Canadians come to grips with that would be my strong advice.
Merci, Monsieur Collins, s'il vous plaît.
It's interesting. I've been here a couple of years. I like deadlines. I've seen Parliament kick around ideas forever with everybody stated the importance of the issue and why it matters to everybody, and we should really do that. And as soon as I hear the word should, I start to lose faith, right? Because we will do this or that. So I take your comments, David, about moving from that expansive to a deliberative focus. And I'm a visual learner. I went through the BC process as an observer and needed to see maps. I mean, maybe it's because I'm engaged in politics in this way. I just want to see how it's going to look. And until I see that, it's so theoretical and perhaps confounding. Mr. Fox, you're nodding. Is at some point the committee start to get to that point for Canadians and say, here's a couple of the three, let's just pick a number, 3 choices we're looking at. Here's how it might look in New Brunswick, in Toronto, in Vancouver, in rural Canada. Is this important for us in terms of that engagement level and then raising the level of legitimacy of all this work?
I think it is. I think the more you can get to actual concrete details around your models, it'll increase public confidence in the fact that you've done the homework and that you have come to a common view. And when you think about what happens after your report, the more you all agree on the greater number of details, the more it might be interesting or beneficial for the government to follow through on your leadership, because this is where the national conversation has happened.
We've also heard from elections officials that as the committee or Parliament, more importantly, starts to narrow down, they begin their work as an elections commission. That they start to, if they can tell Parliament's headed towards one of these models, that whole idea of this being too rushed and then there's a panic and then the next election doesn't come off coherently, if I can put it that way, is diminished if Elections Canada has given early signals. This is a couple of paths that we're taking. David, you'd agree with it?
Absolutely. They are the ones who administer the election, and they're responsible for its proper administration at the end. So yeah, they got to get going.
So, can I?
Yeah, sure.
Make it 2 sentences. One is, it kind of goes back to that CBC suggestion. At some point, having this committee in a deliberative mode with the institutional design choices of an MMP, I just taught it last term, the 15 main institutional design choices, maybe 7 are crucial. Having the different models in play where you're all working through together in maybe a slightly hypothetical way, because you're not all committed to each of these, or maybe any of them, in a well-moderated way where you can possibly film it, it can be possibly done in public. Consider something like that. Make yourself like a mini citizens' assembly in the way you interact.
This is what, back in February, we had suggested to government was have a parallel citizens' assembly process working through some of those on-the-ground truth-telling of what a system would mean. What does this mean for me in Mississauga, et cetera? I want to we talk about trade-offs a lot here. This is what it's going to be. It's always the case. Whenever we redraw boundaries in the country, there's all trade-offs. One of the trade-offs I'm concerned about is this list thing. I got to tell you, I'm not a huge fan of the closed list system, just in terms of legitimacy in the eyes of the voters. Who's on the list? How did they get on the list? Is it just knowing the leader of the party? Are you a fundraiser? The notion that the voters got to be involved. We've seen some models come forward that says that list is derived from the next most popular candidate in that region as a way to legitimize their place and not have 2-tiered MPs, that the voter chose that person goes ahead, not somebody in a back room. Any thoughts on that model versus the other in the trade-off question?
Yeah, you've absolutely hit the issue on the head, and we wrestled with it. It was one of the final pieces of the puzzle that we actually worked through on it. Our way of, and we came to a choice on it. And it was unanimous report, so we understood it. But we had a companion piece because of our large mandate covering all these aspects of democratic reform in New Brunswick for changes to party democracy. And so one of the ways to get at that was that we had legislative changes proposed for how parties conducted nominations, and it was, for some, maybe perhaps seen as more interventionist, but we required open nomination processes and things to avoid the kind of the top-down process. Not to say that the parties would have liked that, but that was our way of trying to get at the kind of concern that you raised, to try to make it more transparent and try to make it more open.
Merci, Monsieur Thériault, s'il vous plaît.
I'll raise three subjects to start. If I properly understood what you said, Mr. Fox, you prefer that we do things properly rather than rush. I understood the same thing from Mr. McLaughlin. I think that the worst scenario would be if the legislative power that we represent here wraps up its work on December 1st. And we would allow the executive branch to decide the follow-up, given the fact that I don't think that in 3 weeks we can really have a fair understanding of what voters want from one ocean to the other. But that being said, it would perhaps be well advised for this committee to reach a consensus on the recommendation to continue and to leave between the hands of the legislative branch and the executive branch the next step. There will be a next step before the executive branch can take on the issue, and because of its parliamentary majority, it thinks that this lowest common denominator is that everyone wants change, but it could decide for itself what kind of change it wants. And then that's a total failure.
I see that you're nodding, so you agree. On the matter of gender parity, the Quebec experience has led us to feel that that is a good idea. And there are ways to influence the situation for increased parity. But no system would allow us to act directly on that. I have myself done some recruitment, and what I have discovered is that it's not an issue of giving a stronghold riding to a woman. It's more about what federal politics represents. It would be a good idea to work on work-life balance in the federal parliament. I can say that having experienced the Quebec context. And if we don't do that, even with lists, I don't think we're going to be able to recruit and reach gender parity. In some age categories, we won't be able to recruit some excellent candidates. What do you think? Mr. Scott mentioned it earlier. I think it's indeed very important to consider not only the mechanical aspects of the reform, but also the effects that it will have on the procedure of Parliament and the House of Commons, and the everyday issues of work-life balance, and also the logistical aspects of geography in federal politics. That's extremely important. When it comes to the matter of changing the culture, Mr. Scott, you said the transition will take a long time, and I agree. It's not just because we change the system that from one day to the next, everyone will work together on the ground. The model brought forward in Quebec would have meant that when I was elected in 2003, my rival would also have been elected because of the list and would have become Minister of Transport. Imagine the cooperation that would have been required. I think it would have led to a great deal of partisanship, because on the one hand there's the representative of government, and on the other someone from the opposition party. So doesn't this mean that we need to concentrate more on the legislative branch ideological plurality in the chamber and making each vote count? But beyond that, if we want to change the culture more, why not elect the executive and make it 2/3 of the members in the House? That's a big question. It's perhaps a good idea, but we don't have time to delve into it further. That's a whole other area. You only have a few seconds left, so Ms. May.
Bit by bit of preamble, when you were talking, Craig, about the fact that this has been an issue since the year 2000, going back through parliamentary records may interest you to know that the first parliamentary committee looking at electoral reform was in 1921, when Ireland had just gotten single transferable vote in order to protect minority rights in Ireland. It's been a topic that's come up, and it seems, and as far as I can determine, every commission, federal or provincial, every citizens' assembly, every law commission, every review of electoral reform since 1921 in Canada, when they come to a conclusion, comes to a conclusion that we should move to some form of proportional representation. So it does seem to me that the time is ripe and that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. But in my questions to you, I wanted to focus on the harms of first past the post, because you raised one, Craig, that Professor Peter Russell identified, that when you combine a Westminster parliamentary democracy such as Canada, where the executive has rather more power than even in other Westminster democracies around the world, and certainly more than in the US, where the executive has checks and balances, that it's rather important to know that the majority of Canadians support the general direction of a majority government. You referenced this rather tangentially in your opening remarks. I wondered if you wanted to revisit the question of the power of the executive and the harms that can be done when you have what Professor Russell calls, and I don't think it's partisan, I don't know how else you describe it, as a false majority, but...
Yeah, we tend to address the false majority notion as in a party simply gets more seats in the legislature than their popular vote would warrant. And that seems unjust, and it's a voter-centered perspective, and that's good, that's fine to say that's a problem. But the fact is, you're giving the majority of seats to a single party in a system where there's a fused executive legislative arrangement that in any Westminster system already gives a lot of power to the executive. But in our political, I wouldn't say it's our political system, it's our political culture. We have a much greater degree of internal party unity, party discipline. I think the localization pressures on our MPs because of the size of the country and other things like that also mean that the extent to which parliamentarians can be legislators as opposed to members of party taking direction from good advice, etc. We have a culture where once you give majority to one party, you are partly at the mercy of how that government runs itself, because you can have more and less willingness to engage with the rest. And the rest could be not just the opposition, but the 60% who didn't actually vote for the party that now has 100% of the power.
And it's a sensitive topic because it's raw, because we just had a change in government. And I apologize to my friends in the Conservative ranks here, but when Gerard Deltel actually put the question to Professor Russell, what harm has ever come from first past the post? And to my surprise, he said, climate change. We didn't act for 10 years. And we had 80% of Canadians since the early 90s by polling have always wanted action on climate change. And I know a lot of Conservatives wanted action on climate change. Unfortunately, one of them wasn't the former Prime Minister. So for me, that's not just a theoretical or academic harm. It's real, and it's damaged our reputation in the world, and it was not something supported by most Canadians. So forgive me for mentioning that one, but I'll turn to my friend David McLaughlin, and I don't want to put you on the spot. Obviously, you are a Conservative. You've made that clear. You were Chief of Staff to our friend, the late Jim Flaherty. But do you have any comments on this executive power in the situation of a false majority? I mean, you were a victim as CEO of the National Roundtable of Omnibus Bill C-38, which was not, I don't think, the will of Canadians. Do you have any thoughts on this aspect of first past the post?
One of the ways that we tried to get at that issue in the Brunswick Commission, again, we had a broader mandate, but I do want to refer you to our section where we talked about making the system work. We did look at improving or enhancing the role of MLAs as individual legislators, enhancing the role of the Legislative Assembly as an institution, and rebalancing power and authority away from the executive branch back to the legislature. We proposed a number of things for strengthened legislative committees, higher funding allowances for MLAs, more extensive committee work, just a broader role for the legislature in what had been traditionally defined as government life. So that allowed us to do that, independent, if you will, of the electoral system piece. But yeah, there's no question that Canada, and I agree with Craig, as a political cultural issue, that we have very strong executive power authority. I've been in the Prime Minister's office. Some days were better than others. Some days you liked it, some days you maybe not. So.
Thanks very much. We'll go to Ms. Romanato, please.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to address one issue and then move on to my question. I know that people have been questioning the timeline, and I know that when we had our Chief Electoral Officer here, he said that this is absolutely possible. And so we're hopeful that this committee will come up with a report that will have a consensus that we'll be able to put into action. So I just wanted to reiterate that. Now, one thing this committee we've been trying to do is, and I've used this term earlier on, is to take a voter-centric approach, because as parliamentarians, we have our own ideas that, okay, well, what does it mean to have a legitimate process? What does it mean to have a process that's simple from our perspective or for the perspective of the voter? And I think that's something that we need to be mindful of when we're out communicating with Canadians. We have done the first phase of this process where we've heard from experts and so on, and now we're going on the road. We're taking it to the road. Given your expertise in this file, we know there's some low-hanging fruit that could address the bobo that we have in our system that's not necessarily a different voting system. For instance, changing the voting date to Sunday or a day that people are not working and so on. But keeping the voter-centric in mind, what would you recommend when we are engaging with Canadians on the road so that we are making sure that whatever system we put forward or any recommendations we put forward are in fact reflective of what they are looking for?
Let me start. Let my colleagues reflect a bit more. So force them into some trade-offs. I mean, you have to do it. Find out what they value most. Come up with your series of principles. Explain how they can work in comparison to others, but find out what they value most. I suspect that local representation will be very close to the top of the list. They'll want to know who their MP is. They want to know where you live, right? Because it's that accountability and that possibility of throwing you out afterwards in the blunt democratic instrument, that's fine. So that would be one example I think would jump up to the top, but try to force them a bit on that. And then, if you can, find out what they really want from an electoral system in the sense of, let me riff off what Elizabeth May said in terms of the central authority, the executive authority. I mean, do they think it will cure this versus something else? You may have a role in helping to address myths as well as improvement. So don't let the myths stand out there, on that if something, if we change the electoral system, we can fix A, B, C, and D. Help them understand what those absolute choices are and help them appreciate where, this is an improvement, but not a panacea, if you will. So off the top, that'd be something that I think you could think about.
Before the other two go, I'm just going to probe a little more on that. You mentioned that if what they value most is to know their MP and know where their MP lives, and trust me, I have people showing up on my lawn. That being said, why would we ever recommend a closed list? I'm just throwing it out there. If people want to know who they're voting for, the person, not just the party, the person, and is that a person that knows us? Why would we ever put forward a closed list?
Well, again, the closed list is a mechanical process or step to get to the electoral outcome. So it's you would have a closed list. I mean, the reasons I gave are what we're populating our minds at the time, and it can seem as kind of lack of transparency, unaccountable, etc. But it was the outcome that we were more concerned about along the way by. I'm talking about where do you live? It's sort of a euphemism for afterwards when you are elected. They want to know who to go to help solve their problems and of course represent their broader interests. At the end of the day, I'm not convinced a closed list or open list is absolutely germane to that. I think it's a way station en route to it.
I'll let the two of you.
I just briefly, I think Dave was sort of predicting what might rise to the top, but in terms of the closed list, keep in mind that there is a direct analogy. People actually are already faced with closed lists in our current system. It's a one-person list, but each party is the one that generates who the only person is you can vote for if you're leaning towards a particular party or set of principles. You know who are on the list generated by the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, the NDP, the Greens, etc. It's all transparent, and adding in the ability to then tick is an added element, but you know who you're voting for on these lists, and then you can evaluate how did they produce that list. I'm not going to vote for a party that produced the list that way. I'm more inclined to vote for a party that produced it that way. So closed list doesn't mean they're closed in all senses. It just means you can't go in and change them. And the last thing is, when I went on a tour as official opposition critic, I think about 12 different sessions across the country, I started with a list of something like 10 or 11 different principles or variables that they have to be a lot more specific than the ones for the mandate of the committee. Got people to fill out at the beginning, before there was any discussion at all, where they were on this. It took about 5 to 10 minutes. Then there was whatever the session was, and then I had them do it again. Now this was slightly biased because people were coming knowing I was NDP, knowing that we already were in favor of PR, et cetera, et cetera. So it didn't represent Canada, but it represented where people started. That was the most valuable. Okay. And then it represented change. The change wasn't so great, but for your group, the changes could be quite important.
Thank you. Mr. Richards.
Thank you. Mr. Fox, a question or two for you. You made the comment in your opening remarks, and I think I am quoting this accurately because I was trying to keep up writing it down, but I'm pretty close, if not bang on here. And it was that Canadians themselves must participate meaningfully, and their collective wisdom be part of the process. I take that to mean that you think the current process isn't succeeding in that, and I'm wanting to get your opinions or thoughts on what this should look like. What would give Canadians that meaningful participation? What would allow their collective wisdom to drive the process or push the process?
You're reading me correctly in the sense that I don't think that the process is doing that yet, but I'm not sure the process needed to do it at this stage, in the sense that it is important to do the research and get to facts and essays and papers. But I think as you think about what you do with the meetings you're going to be holding on the road, reinforcing the last two comments, you'll be limited in your options because of the travel schedule and the calendar, but I would try, to David's point about asking people to make choices. I think there's a lot to that. And asking people to, part of the limits of hearings like this is I get my 5 minutes and then I leave the room, and someone else comes in and they get their 5 minutes and then they leave the room, but I don't get the benefit of having heard the person who was before or after me, or signal to you that I've changed my mind maybe based on what I've heard. So repositioning or relaunching questions in a certain city. If there was a theme that was kind of emerging as an element of consensus in Winnipeg, test it in Halifax. We heard this in Winnipeg, and we heard it a lot. What do you people think? Yeah. To try and get to how do you bring all of those views together in a way that just isn't a long list? Because frankly, if it is going to be kind of the monologues in rapid succession, you might as well just ask for emailed submissions.
Okay, fair enough. I appreciate that. You've written fairly extensively on parliamentary reform as well, and I think that ties to what we're doing here. I think that when you look at we've heard a lot of testimony, I guess, that talks about the different trade-offs that there is with the different electoral systems, and certainly I think almost universally held, if not universally, that there's no perfect electoral system. And obviously we've heard from a lot of people that we have to be looking at what are the values, what are the goals that we're trying to achieve. You yourself mentioned that the public doesn't seem to really be aware yet of what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that the electoral system and changes to our elections can be one of the things that we can do to try and solve some of the issues that there might be. But parliamentary reform may solve some of the issues. Maybe it solves all the issues that might exist. But I guess my question for you is, what do you see as some of the other potential changes that we could be looking at on a parliamentary level, and could some of those meet some of the challenges that we face? Or
Excellent question. I'm not sure I would go all the way to say that parliamentary reform or other reforms would fix all of the issues that because, frankly, we have to worry first about the men and women who we send to the Commons before we worry about what they do once they get there. But certainly, and I think for the last 15 years, it's been more of an interest of mine looking at what happens here once people get here. But my hope is, if we are to change the mode of election, and if we are to have a House that is more reflective of popular vote, that diffusion of who gets to decide may also have an impact on committee independence and whip votes in the Commons. I understand the imperatives of needing to drive messages tightly, and people don't like disagreement because it's messy, and those who cover politics will make it seem a weakness or a flip-flop. But I would genuinely like to see governments rediscover white papers and asking committees to conduct some preliminary work long before they've decided what it is that they want to do. That's independent from electoral reform, but I think one may feed into the other and facilitate it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Richards. Mr. Corsi.
Lachlan, just one more point of clarification on the issue of the closed party list, because I understood well the reasoning for that in your reply to Mr. Aldaig's question and to Nathan's question as well. Achieving representational equity is the main idea behind the closed party list. It's the party that produces the list. How does the open convention that gives the party license to produce the list work in this recommendation in the report?
Well, the way it worked is that we thought that parties were, as legitimate actors. They had the right to sort of incent and choose the folks that they wanted to represent them, but we wanted to create an incentive and sort of a public pressure on them to do so. And we know that parties. Let's go back to how you operate. You operate in a competitive environment. You are seeking political advantage in the best sense of the word relative to your competitors, putting your best foot forward, in one way, showing that you are more in favor of one issue or another, showing your representation. I mean, how many campaigns in the past while have we had party leaders showcasing candidates behind them, number of women, number of visible minorities, etc. I mean, this is the party's way of adapting to a new reality and a new pressure within the country under a first-past-the-post system. I mean, we show the candidates, that we have to say that we look like Canada, if you will. So, the nature of it was. Again, the issue you raised was one we wrestled with, and there were strong opinions on both sides. But the feeling was that the imperative was, the trade-off we made was that we wanted to have more women elected as MLAs, and that seemed to us, there were other issues there, and that seemed to us to trump. The commissioner's views trumped the other kinds of concerns. But I don't want to diminish this, as you raise, Mr. Corsi, the issue of transparency, sort of democratic legitimacy. It was something that we wrestled with. But at the end, we made a choice based on the trade-offs, and it's a legitimate example of how you will have to work through the stuff as well. And we did hear from parties too. I mean, and so the other part in there, and I'll finish with that, is that I reinforce what I said earlier. Parties are legitimate actors here. We need strong political parties. They are the partisan vehicles, in the best sense of the word, to allow views and issues and ideas to be debated. I mean, I'm in favor of partisanship if it allows for clarification of ideas, if it gives choice. I think that's a good thing for a democracy. So a bit of perhaps going the other way on the closed list. I get it, but that was our reasoning.
But effectively, as opposed to having party members vote for their preferred candidate, as would happen in a constituency riding, would the party essentially trot out the candidates that would be on the list, say this is our 1, 2, 3, 4, and then have it vetted to the party membership? Is that how that works?
No, we tried to move. We knew that was a possibility. Yeah, absolutely, parties being parties and leadership being leadership of parties. So we encouraged a primary process as well, and as a way to do that. And that's why I mentioned we had companion recommendations and improvements for greater party democracy, to go hand in hand with changes to the electoral system. Again, part of thinking through the consequences of changing the system without thinking through what are the companion actors or issues that go with it. I mean, changing the electoral system creates a cascade of effects that you will need to wrestle with.
Mr. Fox, you talked a little bit about rallying Canadians to some sort of consensus on what malaise or what issue we're trying to resolve here. One of the issues that I believe has the potential to rally us together is the idea of better engaging Canadians in the way they see Parliament reflected, the way they see themselves reflected in Parliament, particularly Canadians who feel disengaged with the system. And I know there are Canadians who feel that their vote isn't represented in Parliament, but there are also Canadians who don't vote and therefore are completely disengaged. Is that a spot, do you think, we can start, and how best do we engage those people who have not traditionally seen themselves as a part of the process?
As much as I don't worry about mandatory voting, my own personal view would be that I'm not sure that's a convincing long-term way of fixing one's commitment to the system. But David was mentioning earlier that there have been over time when elections turnout was high at elections where people felt like there was something at stake, which usually coincided with a change in government, but not necessarily. 1988 being the first example where there was a genuine issue of fundamental public policy choice that drove people from both points of view out to the... So I think part of trying to get citizens interested in political life and democratic life is to make sure that they understand that that their input matters, that you didn't decide before you showed up, that they do in their interventions have an opportunity to move the yardsticks, and I think that goes a long way. Like if I don't feel like there's a point, why would I go?
Okay, thanks. We'll go to Mr. Boulris.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start by saying that my colleague and I don't have a lot of diversity on this issue. We're two men, we're both white, we have different hairstyles, but still. But we do have very different points of view on one thing. Nathan's is 330,000 square kilometers, bigger than Poland, and mine is only 11 square kilometers. So in that sense, Nathan and I have very different work to do. When we look at the systems that exist in Germany, New Zealand, Denmark, Holland, and so on, there are many very interesting points. But one can't just copy-paste the system here. That's why Jean-Pierre Kingsley's idea, which is to create a built-in Canada method inspired by other countries, is an excellent idea. I think we should consider that. I think we can reach proportionality in 3 different ways: provincial lists, regional lists within provinces. Some provinces are bigger than others. Or fusing various ridings so we can have plurinominal districts with 3 to 6 members who represent the region. That works on the island of Montreal, but it doesn't work so well in areas like Mr. Cullen's or in the Northwest Territories. So there are various different ideas on this. We can maintain some ridings where the first past the post system remains, and in urban or suburban areas, we can instead use a proportional method. Could you tell us what you think about that? Yes, we could use a system like that. There's no constitutional objection to that, I believe. It's very important to create exceptions for the northern ridings and perhaps very large rural ridings as well, even though they're farther to the south. So in that case, a mixed member proportional system should be adapted to Canadian realities. I believe that Mr. Kingsley's proposal has a great deal of merit, but the idea that all ridings that have less than a certain proportion of towns should continue to have only one member, I don't know if that's a good idea. We can combine ridings except in the north. In the north, they should remain as is.
With a made-in-Canada system. I mean, you'll be informed by electoral systems elsewhere, but we have different realities. Language, of course, another thing, but geography is perhaps the biggest defining thing. So in New Brunswick, it meant to do the proportionality that we came up with without increasing the size of the House. So that meant that the single-member ridings were a little bit larger, and they're very tiny, but they were larger for people what some of them wanted. And that. So you have to think about that if you're going to go this way to try to address this issue, which I think is very legitimate. Do you want a bigger House of Commons? How do you allow for that? Because you will have, these kinds of inequities, and you will still want to keep the variances down to a manageable level in terms of representation of population, which is part of a redrawing boundaries process, which you will, by necessity, have to go through here. So some kind of hybrid system is something, I don't know if it's the right system. Again, I go back to my presentation. We haven't had that kind of study here. We've had, studies of mixed member proportion. We've looked at the key principles, but the application of it with maps, with boundaries, thinking about the roles of members of parliament, how many in one province or region versus others, that's really quite consequential and matters a lot to voters. It's an interesting notion, and I encourage you to pursue it and see. You may end up saying we need a larger House of Commons, and then the euphemism for MMP becomes many more politicians, right? and it kind of goes it goes from there. So not to be pejorative or anything.
Il nous reste 5 secondes, là, c'était vraiment...
You have just 5 seconds left. Thank you. Mr. Reyes, please. When I entered politics in 2003 at the provincial level for the first time, I saw a message. Someone gave me advice for politics. He said, as long as you treat voters intelligently, like they're intelligent, they will always respond intelligently. At the end of the line, the voter is always right. When we give them the opportunity to express themselves, obviously with the right information, and if they've had the time to become informed on a subject. With respect to changing the voting system, and that is the central component of the reform, because there are many other things we could do, and we're in agreement on this. How would you explain to all, this question is to all three witnesses, how would you explain that most of the time in Canada, when we've consulted Canadians, whether through poll, but not through consultation of interest groups, because interest groups come to see us and they say that everyone thinks the same way they do because they're presenting their opinion, and they make it seem like their proposal is unanimous. When there's a consultation of Canadians by referendum, most of the time they've rejected the option, or they wanted to keep the status quo. How would you explain that, despite, well, I think governments have the financial means to explain this, and so do chief electoral officers. How do you explain this desire to not change the system? First of all, and I'm perhaps wrong, but in the case of British Columbia, there was a simple majority in favor of the change but the threshold was set above that. It was 57%. So there are maybe some people who want change. So with respect to the principle that people are rejecting it, on the contrary, it's not that they're rejecting it, it's that perhaps they appreciate what they have. That's very possible. What is your opinion about this trend other than British Columbia? Well, in the case of Ontario, the election during which I was a candidate, and the referendum was held at the same time as the provincial election in 2007, it seemed to me that the government in power had stated that it would not campaign for or against the change, and the official opposition, for which I was a candidate, also was a bit gray on the matter. So we let people campaign in their own ridings on the matter. The status quo and the unknown, well, status quo is more comfortable. But I think that in situations where no one is making the argument in favor of change, it can also mean that we're perhaps more comfortable with what's familiar. But on the issue of treating voters fairly and giving them the information, I'm in complete agreement with you. They don't make wrong decisions.
Works for us. At the end of the day, that typically works for the system. We've, one of the reasons why is that we accept the results. We have good winners and we have good losers. Good losers around the table, if you will, who then participate in a different way, not having won the main prize, the main chance, but say agree to participate in as loyal opposition or members of the opposition, etc. That's the nature of the system. So we accept and we move on. I've been involved in referendums. I was involved in the constitutional referendum in 1992 with Prime Minister Mulroney, traveled everywhere with him on that basis. And yeah, I mean, I saw firsthand where the animus towards him personally helped color the results, etc. And that, so, I mean, there can be other things that can come in, but to say that the public didn't know about the issues, they didn't know all of the things that were in Charlottetown. In fact, they liked the package of Charlottetown as a package. They didn't like individual elements. So perhaps it was too much that was put forward. So that's sort of a learning. We do know that as well, from elections, why is it that as practicing politicians, you tend to go out door to door with your literature and hammer one message, and I've been a campaign manager, one message to the exclusion of others, because you try to simplify it, you try to put it in terms that matters to the public, etc. You haven't yet found that sweet spot on this issue. Perhaps it will emerge in the process. But in the absence of a compelling argument to change, something that Graham at the outset, or in advance of a concerted, independent effort of education, of information that, in my view, would have to accompany a referendum process, then the public will, I suspect, sort of revert back to, I'm not certain I trust this, I'm not certain, etc. And then probably that's more of a vote for the status quo.
Merci.
If you were making a change, you've got to make the case for change very strongly.
Merci beaucoup. On termine.
Thank you very much. We'll wrap up the week with Ms. Sahota.
I want to move towards finding other ideas, made in Canada solutions, and I think we can adopt a lot of these systems to perhaps fit into our country. We have vast differences from a lot of other countries. Redrafting boundaries is going to be a hurdle. It would be complex. Having ballots that have far too many options would be a problem. We've been talking about a lot of these different issues that we're facing, as well as the values that are important. And I know fairness, keeps coming up when we want to move towards PR. And then there's also these other issues that we've been talking about throughout the week that I feel we haven't created a really concrete causal connection to, which is female representation, diversity, other things to PR. Because there's so many factors in play when you look at those things that I don't think any electoral system, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from all of our witnesses, we don't have a direct link at this point that, gives cause and effect. So I would like to take a look at some slightly different options. Mr. Scott, you had mentioned the Jenkins Commission and an option that they proposed because they didn't want to increase the number of their members and didn't want to perhaps redraft boundaries. They went beyond AV but try to make it more proportional, but I'm not quite sure if you can lay out the differences between what they had come up with and MMP. Is it the same? How does it differ?
Yeah, some call it AV plus, some call it MMP plus. So I call it MMP plus because it's MMP, but when you're electing on the local side, instead of using first past the post as we do, you use the ranked ballot. And so you produce the locally elected deputies, MPs that way. That's the only difference. And but they also were quite fierce in their criticism of AV as a standalone reform, where you just keep single-member districts and use AV. And I don't know what the compromise dynamics were, whereby they must have seen a separate set of good reasons why, having more general support, even if some of its second preferences, counts for something, and they embraced it. I can't quite remember their reasoning. That was the only difference.
From MMP.
From MMP.
Okay. We saw from this panel that we had from Scotland that, and we've heard testimony that once people go towards PR, they don't go back, but I'm just perplexed a little bit why that referendum in the UK didn't work, since so many regions and their municipalities have changed towards a different system. But
the one on, I think their referendum was on alternative vote, not on PR.
Okay.
Yeah. It wasn't.
So it was the question. It was the choice that was presented to people. They didn't.
And it wasn't tied to the Jenkins Commission report. It was a separate alternative vote was the proposal, and it was voted down. But
it was a coalition agreement with the Liberal Democrats. I think as part of the agreement to form a coalition, they said the Conservatives agreed to have a referendum on this preferred system. So that was the price of a coalition. There are prices to be paid in forming coalition governments. May I just, on your comments, Ms. Sahota, about made in Canada or a different system, or et cetera, I would encourage you, encourage anybody in this business, because it is what animated us and drove us. The more it looks like a system that Canadians are familiar with the change, the easier it will be to find acceptance. The idea of a whole new system that, like from stem to stern, as we say back home in the Maritime, I mean, that's, you're going to end up running against that view of that's a lot of change. Why that? What's the problem, etc. And so part of MMP that why we moved that way is it still had single member plurality, so everybody still did a same vote for a local member the way they did before. It introduced a degree of proportionality, and so the amount of proportionality depends on the splits. We went 2/3, 1/3, and there are other design features there. So we didn't think it was that big a step for people. So it's something that it's just some advice in terms of cautioning you as you think about the way that you want to go ahead. A big new system may deal with all the trade-offs, may deal with all the principles. It just may be a step too far for Canadians to accept, given we do have an attachment to this system because in part we're comfortable with it, and we do see it generally seems to work. We know as experts, and you're living in it, that there are certain flaws with it. I'm not certain that very many Canadians see that on a day-to-day basis. So just some gratuitous advice, if you like, but just in response to I think, a good question you asked.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So this is the end of our discussion, and I would simply like to thank once again the witnesses for their perspectives, which were very well developed and very clearly explained. And once again, Mr. Scott, it was a pleasure to see you again on the Hill.
For some future business, it'll go very quickly. It will, I think it will. So thank you very much.